Okay, everyone. We're just 1 minute past 2, but we've got a minute or two to do the introductions. And so as people come on, you're not missing anything until around 5 minutes past. So thank you again for joining us for an additional TASO webinar. My name is Omar Khan. I'm the director of TASO, and this is Miriam. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Miriam Stinal. I'm the Establishing Evaluation Manager for TASO.
So you'll be hearing from Miriam for most of today. As I said, thank you for joining us for this third installment in our evaluation webinar series. We can't see each other, as you all know, but there are quite a lot of you joining today. I think it's over 100. And I think probably, as you all know, you're all muted, which means that you can ask questions, but we won't be able to hear you. But we're delighted to see so much interest in our work, and I'm just going to give you a few housekeeping points. As I said, you're all automatically muted and your videos are off. You can interact, and we welcome your interaction with questions through the session using the Q&A function. We won't answer your questions in the chat box, but we'll pick them up at the end in the Q&A. So I do encourage you to enter questions at any point, but there'll be a distinct break at the end of the webinar where I will try to collect the questions and direct them at Miriam. And we'll try to get through as many of those as we can. If we don't get to your question, please do send us an email afterwards. I'd also like to remind you that we're recording the session, and we'll distribute the recording and presentation slides to all of you afterwards. Finally, we are after your feedback. We ourselves are trying to make sure that we're good evaluators of our own work. So please keep an eye out for a post-event survey in your inboxes, and do fill it out and respond to us over the coming days. If some of you have come on and you missed my intro, all you missed was me setting out some ground rules and some housekeeping. If you haven't missed any content, please don't worry. And I'm now handing over to Miriam for an outline of the session and to kick off and run the seminar. Thank you.
So yeah, welcome everyone. Just as a quick outline, Omar will quickly talk a bit about TASO for a slide, and then we'll jump straight into the last 2 steps of our evaluation framework, which are the measure and reflect stage. So in the measure stage, we'll talk a bit about how you develop your data collection and your measurements and indicators and what you need to be mindful of in both of them. And then the reflect stage, we'll briefly talk about a concept called knowledge mobilization. So the idea is not just to produce evidence and knowledge, but also to kind of disseminate and get people to share and act on your knowledge and evidence findings. And then last but not least, we'll talk around how you can report your findings to ensure that knowledge mobilization is maximized. And then at the end of the session, hopefully we've got a bit of time for questions again, so 10 minutes more or less. So very briefly, before we start, as I mentioned, a quick introduction to TASO.
Okay, so there you see the quick introduction to TASO. Just hold on, I'm just making sure there's some Q&A, that there's no problems with the technology, because we had some technology problems. Okay, so welcome to TASO. As you can see, we're an independent hub for higher educational professionals. I'm the first director. It's my first month in the job. We're quite a new organization. I was previously the director of the Runnymede Trust, which is a race equality organization, but I also have a background in higher education. I was on the board of the University of East London previously. And we're here to try to support the sector. Our work requires us to try to figure out what works in higher education in terms of transforming access and student outcomes, from the widening participation when the entirety of the student life cycle. But obviously, to do this effectively, we need to work with you, with the sector, because we're not the ones actually implementing these measures. So today, as part of, we see this as helping to scale up the sector and to learn from you in terms of what you're doing and what else you need. We are an affiliate of other What Works centers. There's about 9 of these. And it's a sort of government approach in terms of how to make sure that we have better evaluation of public policy generally. So in areas, other areas are like social care and young people. We are a consortium, or we were set up as a consortium by King's College, Nottingham Trent, and Behavioral Insights team, as you see there, but we will be spinning out as an independent charity in the coming months, we hope. And finally, you can see there that we're funded by the Office for Students, which gives us a solid kind of financial beginning for the organization, but I think also shows that the buy-in from the regulator about this work. And I think, you know, it is important that the Office of Students are regulating and are concerned about issues of access and participation, but I also think they're trying to support and help impact evaluation. So their support for us, I think, is an important sign of their commitment to this work.
Brilliant. Thank you, Omar. Okay, so for those of you who've joined before, this slide will probably trigger a bit of déjà vu for you now, but I quickly want to start, as I always start, to talk about the evaluation cycle, because one of the first questions I always get is, when should I evaluate an initiative? At TASO, we consider evaluation to be iterative. So something that the circular design of the evaluation cycle already indicates. It's a process that supports continuous improvement. So the findings of your evaluation in the measure stage that we'll go through today should feed into the reflection part on your implementation when you write things up and reflect what you've learned. And that will then inform your diagnose stage, so your evaluation narrative, and then obviously your evaluation plan, your research methods, and your research questions for future program cycles. What we hope that this does is that your evaluation with each continuous cycle becomes more accurate and targeted. By repeating and refining your evaluation strategy based on these re-emerging evaluative findings, your findings become more robust as you learn more and more about what works every year. And ideally, over time, you'll start to see these emerging patterns. You start understanding what the effect and impact of your program might be, and you can generalize these findings from annual kind of insights towards general impacts. Crucially, and as I said, like during the last two webinars, one of the main points I'd like attendees to take out of these series is that your evaluative findings should be seen as just one strand of a multifaceted approach to mobilizing knowledge. So your findings at the last step of the circle, so the reflect cycle, should be seen as foundation for future activities rather than an end product in and by itself. So today, in our first and final session, we'll focus on measurement and reflect. And what I hope that it will show you today is that we'll be able to open the so-called evaluation black box. So one of the, in my opinion, unfair criticisms that impact evaluation oftentimes get is that it's a black box of measuring whether something works, but that it neglects to tell us why or how and for whom. So the black box, as in, like, you put the research question in, the research finding come out, but you don't really know what happens within that box. So today we learn how to draw on all of your stages in the evaluation cycle, from, as you can see here, your theory of change elements, to the research question that underlines the data that helps you identify how inputs lead to activities, lead to change through your outputs, all the way through your inputs. And we understand what change we want to envision. As a result of investigating each element of the theory of change with data and analyzing it in the most appropriate way, we will be able to draw much richer policy lessons of what works. Not just what works, but for whom, why, and when. And due to that nuance, we'll be much more able to generalize from our evaluation knowledge and be able to report on this and make sure that our findings become knowledge, or even baseline knowledge, for teams and programs and how they want to engage from the input, activity, output, outcome, impact stage at each of those different journeys. So talking about data collection. So where can we get data? Very quickly on this part, as I'll assume that most of you as implementers, managers, or evaluators of in and outreach activities in higher and further education will be aware of this, but there are different ways and sources to collect data. Starting from existing sources, which are also called secondary ratios. So this is data that researchers have been using for a long time. They can be publicly available data, so it's been made public and researchers just use that data for their specific analysis. Some of it is administrative data, so some of that can be public, but not all of it. So think about the administrative data that you might have in your institutions. You can sometimes access that as a university evaluator, but I, as an evaluator at King's, wouldn't be able to do that in return. So again, you might need authorization to do so, and that can take a really long time. But similar to public data, you can then use that data that was collected by other teams to use for your own analysis and research. And then there is plenty of other secondary data sources, again, like by research teams that have collected that data in different contexts, but that might also be applicable for you. So the example here, we've got a young woman researching a secondary data via literature review, for example. The other form of data is primary data. So primary data is data that is collected by the researcher or by yourself. So you collect it yourself in order to obtain the data that you need to answer your program-specific research questions. They can roughly be separated into non-survey and survey collation methods, but there is a lot of different primary data, and we'll talk about that as one of the foci that we have for today's sessions. But very briefly, I want to touch up on secondary data and why this can also be quite useful for us. So the interesting thing about administrative data and secondary data is that a lot of the outcomes and metrics that we might require for our evaluation could already be tracked by a government or an organization, or have been done by a different research team, and they've published their anonymized data source. So sometimes it can be really useful and an effective way for us to just search for secondary data first before we go into the field and basically collect the same data again. Why is it useful? Because it's available retrospectively. So especially if it's been tracked and collected by an organization. So let's think about the Department for Education. It is available for a really long time. You can access it whenever you want. And it allows you to follow up on it for a really long time if you're interested in long-term trends in historical analysis. It sometimes includes nearly all of your population. So that's, again, not always the case. But again, thinking about the resources that organizations like the Department for Education have with a national pupil database, it is as accurate a representation of the pupil population that is out there. So there is no questions around missing data and like only having a certain kind of sample available in your data sources. We think about, for those of you who were present in the last webinar, we think about the self-selection bias around putting yourself forward to participate in research. If it's just data that is collected as standard as usual and includes most of the population, the risk of having that kind of bias in our population is much smaller. So administrative data and secondary data can be really useful for that. Of course, what's really important in an environment where we all work with limited resources is that it reduces not only the logistical burden of having to be in the classroom to collate these surveys or to conduct these interviews, but also it brings down expenses by quite a lot. And then lastly, it may reduce bias and error, because as we talked about last time, when you run an interview or a survey, there might be measurement errors in regards to how people reply to you because they're not completely honest or they don't understand the question, etc. But also there could just be an error in how you then code your data, etc. So administrative data, a lot of times, because it needs to go through quite a lot of quality assurances, has that already like minimized to quite a high standard. So a lot of benefits in using that kind of data. In higher education, just for example, here we've got the Department for Education, as I mentioned, who's got the National Pupil Database that you can apply to get access to. As I mentioned before, it can take really long and there need to be legitimate interest. But a lot of researchers use the MPD data, that's what the abbreviation is, to kind of look at their research aims and to answer their research questions. There's, of course, UCAS, and we talked about the strobe service that UCAS offered last time, and they obviously have probably the most succinct available population of university admissions that there is in this country. And then lastly, HESA, that's the Higher Education Statistics Agency that universities need to report to and provide the individual learner returns every year. So that can be really useful information as well. As per usual, of course, administrative data should be part of a wider and more triangulated approach to research methods. So maybe, as we talked last time, combining administrative data with some field data and other kind of data mechanisms that answer your research questions is probably always the best idea. But now let's focus on primary data collection. So that's a collection that's the data that you collect yourself. There are many ways of doing that. So there's surveys, as we mentioned before, can be e-based, can be paper-based surveys, can be multiple choice surveys where you just take, could be surveys where you write out an answer. There are exams and tests to kind of like collect data on how people are doing in regards to knowledge gains. There's games to kind of sometimes maybe obscure a bit that you are doing data collection if you don't want people to, funnily enough, game your data collection. You could also do direct observations where you don't ask questions, but you just observe what someone is doing if you're more interested in behavioral patterns, or if you think it would be too intrusive to ask questions directly. You could ask participants to do diaries and logs of their activities if you're interested in trends and, as I mentioned before, long-term mechanisms, but also focus groups interviews. There's a large possibilities to collect primary data. So again, like as we mentioned last time when we looked at the research methods matrix, think a lot about like what is the question that you are trying to answer, and if you're unsure about that, maybe go back to the last webinar and just revisit that slide and choose the right data collection that matches your question the best. However, so when we try to measure something, we're basically trying to measure a construct. A construct is, we want to have, I don't know, a better sense of learning of our pupils, or like the effort that teachers put into teaching these kids, or parental involvement, etc. So in our sector and in general, when we're trying to measure concepts in the social world, they tend to be pretty abstract and are something for which we need to decide on a strategy to measure it, or to so-called operationalize it. So we operationalize a construct by using an indicator, which might be familiar to those of you who attended the last webinar. So indicators are a direct answer to your construct to find a way to measure that kind of vague idea. For example, an indicator for parental engagement could be the numbers of hours parents help their kids doing their homework, or the number of meetings that a parent attends at school can be an indicator for parental engagement in a school setting. Oftentimes, and we talked about that briefly last webinar, various indicators are available for one construct. So it's important to find one that is as closely matching the idea of your construct as possible. So once we've identified these indicators, there's the actual data collection. So collecting that data for the indicator. So you run, for example, test scores on children. You have surveys where you ask parents how much time they spend with their kids, or you get access to the registries at school that show how many parents actually attended meetings, etc. For all these different steps in the measurement process, we need to be aware of two things. First of all, validity. So validity means that we want to be sure that the indicators we're going to use actually map to the construct we are trying to measure. And as I mentioned, it can sometimes be a bit tricky because constructs are abstract and indicators like are measurements that we need to find to kind of reflect that abstract construct. So validity is really this relationship between concept and indicator, and the more accurate the indicator is, the higher the validity of it is to measure that construct. Unfortunately, as I said, we can never be 100% sure because real worlds are complex and social constructs aren't easy to translate into measurable data. For example, let's think about parental involvement, right? Like that's quite abstract, and we'll get to the indicators that we might be able to use there. But also, like even more so, think about concepts like intelligence or confidence. They are really difficult to measure, partly because they are highly correlated to indicators we can't measure. Like we talked about those, the unobservable ones that we can't control for in any kind of measurement. Nevertheless, we try and make sure that our idea of a construct and the corresponding indicator are not too far away. And ideally, what you'll have with an iterative evaluation cycle is that you'll learn to identify what indicators are less or more valid in order to measure the construct for your program. So that's the validity of it. Like how well does an indicator map to the concept? Next to that, we have the reliability issue. So reliability is a relationship between your indicator, what you're trying to measure, how you measure the construct, and the final data that you get. So reliability tests whether the indicator is measured in a way that is both consistent and precise. So if we collect the same indicator several times, are we actually getting the same results each time? For some cases, it's pretty obvious, right? Like measuring height. If you measure me 10 times, unfortunately, you get the same height every 10 times. Or fortunately, I just don't like that I'm small. Anyway, but often, like the data collection, like the reliability doesn't match that perfectly. And there are differences between the measurement and the reliability of your measure. So what we're trying to do here, ideally, when we find our indicators and we collect the data, is find something that is as valid and as reliable as possible. So using a bullseye dartboard to summarize what we want to achieve in regards to reliability and validity, but also what can happen that minimizes validity and reliability of your measures. The ideal dream scenario here on the bottom right is high validity and high reliability, the center of the bullseyes. So we both know that it measures the construct really well, but also it measures it the same way every single time we rerun the measurements. So high validity, high reliability, and we can be really confident in what we get out of the data collection. In the next scenario, we have a really high validity, but low reliability. What that means is we do the measurement 1,000 times, and the average measure is close to the construct we want to indicate, but the measure isn't reliable because we do it several times and the results isn't always the same. And then taking, for example, the previous example of parental involvement, using the indicator of numbers of hours spent when we ask the parents, so how many hours did you actually support your kid doing their homework, we're confident that that's actually a really good measurement, right? If we manage to get that information, it's a really good indicator on like how many hours a parent spends, because that's what we're trying to measure. However, the problem is that it's not super reliable because first of all, you cannot have surveyors observing what happens in each household. And then measure the time that parents spend with their kids doing homework. Instead, we have to rely on what people tell you, so what the parents tell you, and there may be difference between what they are declaring or what they're actually doing. And if you ask them on Tuesday how much time they spend with their child on Monday, they say maybe 3 hours. But then you ask them 2 days later, and they might not remember it correctly anymore, or they might have lied on Tuesday, and they say, oh, 1.5 hours. So here we have really high validity, but unfortunately, not very high reliability. And then the opposite is we've got really high reliability. So the measure is really strong and it becomes a bit clearer now. So I'll like speed it up a bit. So you've got the same kind of outcomes every time, but they don't match really well to your constructs. And then lastly, which is the nightmare scenario, is where you've got really low reliability and low validity. So neither your outcome measures like track really well if you do them 10 times. And on top of that, like the indicator just doesn't match to your construct at all. Like a good example there could probably be like if you ask kids how often their parents supported them, especially if it's young kids, they probably don't understand the question or they don't remember really well. And on top of that, they've got the same issue that the parents have, that they just might tell you something different on a different time scale. Again, we've created a common outcome measures framework with indicators for different research questions and objectives that apply quite well to the higher education and further education activity field. So if you went in the last webinar, maybe like revisit that because we talk a bit about it there, and also visit the website to have a look if there might be indicators that we've identified that have relatively high validity and reliability that you can use for your activities when you think about your own measurement goals. However, measurement doesn't just stop at like not matching the construct or not being very valid and reliable. There can also be errors in the way that you collect that data from someone, even if your indicators are really good. So in general, when we talk about measurement error or bias, we need to be aware of the response process. So when we ask someone a question, for example, in an interview or in a survey, there are 4 steps that a respondent goes through, and there are problems at each step. So to illustrate that, let's use an example. So we've got a student here who is being asked on a form to give us his estimate of his total living expenses for the academic year, right? And that's like, nevertheless, if that's a good question or not, what happens in the student's mind is like, first of all, do they actually understand what we are asking here for? Because they might only think about their main living expenses like rent and food, etc., and they miss all these other bits that are on books because they just think that's not what we are asking for in this context. But also, they might not understand what the academic year is, right? Like, is that the whole year? Is that only the year that involves teaching? Is summer term involved, etc.? So there's a lot of issues there that can come up with comprehension. So when you think about the question you're asking or the survey that you're putting in there, like how is it being understood for your respondent? And that can have an impact on how the data you collect actually is valid or not. The second step is retrieval of information. So again, like taking this example where we ask the respondent to estimate their total living expenses during the academic year, they're now tied to remember it, right? And that's, first of all, not an easy concept to remember because it has all these different elements. And on top of that, they need to kind of multiply it by the months in the academic year. So I, for one, am awful in predicting all the types of expenses I have in a month, partly because they aren't that clear and some of them repeat and some of them only come up in certain months, but never mind like trying to estimate how much they actually are. So this form, like there's a form of bias that come in when people have to remember it because they generally can't accurately remember all the information you're asking. And again, be mindful when you ask survey questions or interview questions or any kind of data collection on how this is being like understood and then how people order that information to give back to you. And then the next bit is the estimation and judgment step. So once they've understood your question in the way that they think is correct, and once they remember all the information that they think you are asking for, they need to make a judgment on like, oh, how much is that? Like, what is my opinion on this? So they have to be like, okay, rent might be £600. We're talking about London here. And public transport is that. And like how good people are in estimating that accurately, again, is another source of bias. And that kind of already adds up, right? So it's really important around how you phrase things and like how you need to be mindful of the response process when you collect that data. And then lastly, the fourth step is the actual response. So coming back to our question, and they've gone through like understanding it, reminding it, estimating it, they'll give you a response. And the student is like £10,000. So that's quite tricky because the response might be biased in its by itself. It could be because generally there were mistakes that the student just doesn't remember, etc. But also there might be some reasons to lie. And I think, in my opinion, this is the trickiest and most important like error factor when you run surveys or interviews or any kind of field research, where you need to rely on people going through this response process to understand what is going on when someone is reporting a response. So reasons to lie, for example, could be something called the social desirability bias. So someone just wants to be nice to you and they want to give you like the answer that they think is a nice one and they want to be seen in a good way, but also in regards to, oh, they probably expect me to say that. So there is a bit of a bias there that people might not actually respond with what they're actually thinking, but what they think you want to hear, or because they want to please you in saying that. And then another like good example would be fear to report it accurately, as I think that the information could be either bad to share or they're ashamed to share it. So thinking about expenditures, you might not want to report how much money you spend on takeaway each month or in an academic year, or how often you take an Uber when you probably should take the tube, etc. But then also there are other issues, right? Especially if you ask someone about sensitive topics and you might not want to report how much money you spend on, I don't know, alcohol or other substances. So just be mindful about what to do there in regards to the response. And as usual, as I said before, normally the solution to that lies a bit in triangulation. So think about your research questions. What are you trying to find out? Am I actually trying to find out how much people think they are spending? And I might be quite interested to see how much that matches the reality or not. And then that could be a great way to find out if like people just don't know in general. Or if you're really interested in the living expense of someone, is there a better way to collect that data rather than asking people for surveys? So what I've seen in research being done before, for example, especially around financial management, instead of asking people around how good they are in like money management and why they got into or didn't get into financial trouble, was to set up a data sharing agreement with selected participants that were stratified. So what that means is you took someone on different income levels and people who had applied, for example, for specific grants that would help them get over the summer, etc., if they got into financial difficulties. So we stratified between people who got into financial difficulties or not, and we stratified on people based on their declared household income, for example. And we then asked them to submit their monthly Monzo accounts, where it like really laid out how everybody did. And of course, when you report on this, you wouldn't report on, oh yeah, Miriam's spending on Uber is this much a year, but it gives you an accurate reflection how people actually spend. And it gives you an accurate reflection how people spend depending on like their household income, but also depending on, yeah, how they manage the money. So if that's your question, maybe use a different methodology. As usual, as I said before, triangulation makes 1 + 1 = 3. So use a bit of both because it flashes out not only what happens, but why and for whom and maybe when. And the research method matrix that we mentioned in the last webinar is a great way to look at like what are your objectives, whether they track on like whether you want patterns or whether you want accurate patterns or you want subjective estimates, and then use your data collection mechanism accordingly. So once you've identified all your research aims and you've collected the data and you've got a construct that is like reliably and validly mapped, and you also took account of the response process, and you think you've got good evaluation findings now, or like just evaluation findings, right? Even if it didn't work, you want to like learn from that and go on. We get to the report stage. So the report stage, and quickly before we jump into how to report your findings, I want to touch up on the concept of knowledge mobilization, because I think it's important to take a step back before we sit down and write our reports, to think about the strategic context and environment in which our research findings sit. So I think it's an uncontested statement in this sector to say that everyone in education, and most importantly our students, will benefit if WP and student success initiatives make better use of high quality research evidence to design and improve their policies and practices. However, the bulk of evaluation activity in these fields has been about research production and dissemination, and not really around how to support these different stakeholders in making use of evidence. So when we think about like, what should I do now? Like you've got your evaluation findings, or like you read an evaluation and you're like, oh, what do I do now? It's worth thinking about the way to use and inform our knowledge, and by mapping it in like 3 different areas. But it's both involving individuals and organizations, but also like wider sector actors. So that includes researchers, users of research, and importantly, like intermediaries that sit somewhere in between. And a strong knowledge mobilization plan will require attention to all 3 of those actors. And it's worth considering that all parties interact with another, right? So of course, some interactions will be stronger than others, but also that these interactions work in both ways. So what we want is that practitioners inform research and research informs practitioners, and that mediators in between are a good way to kind of get those 2 together. But again, also they feed into the intermediaries to make sure that the channels are really efficient. And then lastly, you also need to be aware that like your context, whether that's an institution, whether that's on a national or a local level, is like, you need to consider where you stand when you develop your knowledge mobilization strategies. What you'll see there, and like I just want to quickly touch up on that, is that like none of these actors are necessarily mutually exclusive. And especially in our sector, we have a lot of people who are both producers of researchers, who are consumers of researchers, but who also sometimes are the mediators who like hand some piece of research to a colleague to whom that might be of interest. So obviously it's a field that has like a lot of things going on back and forth, but rather than narrowing the notion of applying research, I want us to like mobilize research in like supporting like interactive like processes where research along with like experience and implementation knowledge, can be used to inform action. And we've got a strong feedback system in place where practitioners inform researchers, which inform policymakers, and vice versa, and everything in between. So keeping that in mind, those three kind of actors or parts, knowledge mobilization is a lot about capacity building. So what we'd like is that we slowly build the capacity to be able to do this seamless back and forth of information. However, in order to achieve this production, mediation, and use of robust evaluation and further in higher education, we'll need like a gradual increase in capacity that we can roughly split into 4 areas. So the first one is find. So that's a capacity to access available research. What that means is as a starting point for research use. So you know how to access your available research, and it can be via Google Scholars, it can be by talking to your academics who kind of forwards you emails every week. Like whatever you think is a robust research channel for you, you know where to turn to it for it. But also like it includes things like you need to identify like what am I actually interested in, and like because Google Scholar becomes very overwhelming very quickly if you don't have really clear search terms. So you know what to look for, what's the problem, and what's the question you want to answer, and you are able to review the materials that you find. So once you've found your research, you also want to make sure that you understand what you're reading. So the capacity to evaluate research evidence, which requires a certain research or data literacy in general. So the ability to read, review, and understand what you're actually reading there. And that includes the capacity to critically assess, like, was the RCT really the right methodology to find out whether people are good at estimating what financial spendings they have or not? Was that appropriate? Are the findings really highly like robust and high quality? And like just being able to critically reflect, because just because it's in an academic journal doesn't always mean it's really good research, is something that is also really critical in like that kind of knowledge mobilization flow. And then lastly, what you obviously want in the understanding bit is that you can kind of filter all what you learn from there and apply it to your own context and to evaluate the utility for your kind of program and your research question. And then third and almost last is a shared capacity. So we want to be able to communicate what we found out about research in a clear and open manner. So it requires interpersonal sharing of research via and professional knowledge that because like implementation knowledge is also really useful across your different channels. So not only in regards to the different groups and people and across the organization, but also to build an understanding of how that research is applicable for your daily practices and how you can easily translate that into something that will be useful to making your life as a manager, practitioner, or evaluator much easier. And ideally what comes out of that is that you develop these kind of networks or best practice learning platforms where you share your like research that you find useful, where you share or like where it wasn't useful, and that you like learn and develop like how to use that research in practice. And then lastly, there's the act on bit. So that kind of flows quite nicely, because what you then want to do is once you found the research, you understood the research, you shared the research, so you're like, I'll take, I want to use this. You need the capacity to be able to act on it, right? It's great for us to tell you how to run RCTs, and like you think like, oh yeah, found this, understand what it is, shared it, everybody's on board. But if you can't act on it, like there's a big chunk of the puzzle missing. So at the individual level, you want to make sure that research informs changes in knowledge, in skills, ideas, behavior. And on the organizational level, for example, you want to make sure that it informs like policy changes in the long term. So if we realize that, I don't know, merits tested bursaries don't work for a certain discrete student group, but they are like twice as effective for another group, then you want to be able to act on that. You want to test it in your context and then be able to like translate that. So that's a knowledge mobilization puzzle. And like for us, it's really important that slowly by introducing the framework and then in the long term running more granular toolkits on how to do certain research methods and how to collect all that data and how to, like, as we said before, understand and share it. what's really important is that you obviously report on it in a way that facilitates all these different elements for these 3 different actors, like the users, the mediators, and the producers. So I want to separate that into reporting your findings internally. So what's important to consider when you report within your institution, and to kind of bring that knowledge mobilization around. And then the next slide will focus a bit on how to report your findings externally. So after all your theory on contextual grounding, how can you apply your evaluation to your reporting? And that's actually the really exciting bit, right? Because you're going to start telling people after all the work that you put in there what you found out. And there are like 4 distinct steps that we at TASO are using. So first of all, start with your evaluation results. And of course, that's a bit of a no-brainer, but like you have all your numbers, you've got stories, you've got formative feedback. So all the data that, and it can be anything, not just numerical data. So you've got all of that, and it's worth sharing that with your main stakeholders. And you start from there, and you start filtering on things that you think are really important to share your story. So you establish your internal evaluation story, which again can be guided by like deliverables that you've already produced as part of the evaluation cycle. So you've got a research question that is really clearly defined. In your research protocol, you already set out what method you're using and why. So now it's about bringing all that data together to like tell the story behind your research protocol. Which is the second step. So you decide on the data you think needs to be shared internally. So think a bit about feasibility here. So there's only limited time that you can spend on reporting. So what is really the most important crucial bit here? What is feasible for me to bring together into a document that doesn't end up being a 100-page dissertation? Think about accuracy. So don't twist the data into some form that isn't accurate. Make sure that what you're reporting is actually a reflection of what the data shows, not just part of the story that you want to tell. Think about accessibility, so that it's like that everybody understands what you're saying, obviously, but also when you report on certain data, you need to be mindful that there are information compliance and GDPR reasons, so you can't report on a name basis unless you've got consent for it, etc. So think about all of these bits. And then lastly, think about utility. That probably, again, goes without further explanation, that you want to make sure that your report is as useful as possible for the audience that you have in mind. And then thirdly, you share your results with the appropriate internal stakeholders, and then work together to create a realistic improvement. So what that means is you use the data, you use the story that you're telling to identify what you've learned, both on what went really well, but also what didn't work really well. And you discuss areas for improvement or for amplifying like best practice going forward. Again, previous deliverables can be really useful. So what are like your key internal stakeholders? Ideally, those are the people that are already involved in your theory of change design workshops. So the people that you pull in when you like think through the nitty-gritties of how you're going to achieve your desired change. And realistic program improvement, because of course, ideally we would all want to like completely eliminate like disadvantaged student gaps, but there will be like incremental steps that slowly get you to that bigger aim. So based on what you've learned that year, how can you improve to get to that bigger goal going forward? And discussing that with your internal stakeholder not only creates buy-in, but it also kind of proves your hypotheses there in regards to what can be done or not. And then lastly, revise your evaluation plan and reevaluate. So that kind of closes the gap to what we said before in regards to continuous program improvement. So you kind of integrate your insights into an rise and improved evaluation narrative. You consider, okay, what has been changed, and then you reevaluate all of that. In general, I would say consider every new implementation that includes major changes to your program as a pilot evaluation, and apply the same kind of rigor to your monitoring and evaluation activities as you would have if you'd evaluated that program for the very first time. So internally, it is very much around like verifying your findings with your major stakeholders, and then making sure that everybody learns from what your evaluated findings have brought in, and that your program kind of matures and improves based on these findings. On the external side, again, it's a really exciting bit because you start showing your evaluation results and you can tell like the real impact of your program to your external stakeholders. But what's important here, a bit similar to what we had on the internal side, is that you're not just showing your outcomes straight from your report. Indeed, like research has shown that this passive dissemination of just reports is necessary, but definitely not sufficient to kind of change your users' practice to have this knowledge mobilization going on. So how can you share your evaluations externally? First of all, know your story. And again, you have tons of data, you've got outcomes, you've got probably an intermediate report or two already, but, and it might seem easier to just share those results straight up, but recommend thinking through the process carefully so your message can have a greater impact. Again, you're not completely changing your evaluation story based on your data because your research protocol kind of foolproofs you from not changing direction halfway through. But there's a way you can tell the story, right? So if the data doesn't show what you expected it to be, really focus on lessons learned there, because that is so useful for a lot of other people. And it could be promising emerging evidence that would be useful for like-minded other external stakeholders who are interested in replicating that kind of approach. But also, as I mentioned before, like what doesn't work is, for me, always the most interesting story, because everybody has the same hypotheses, and learning granular details that are so easily overlooked, unless you do them wrong, is really, really useful. So know your story, know what you want to tell based on your data, and really think about how you can structure your reporting to bring maximum impact to that story. Second of all, know your audience. So not everyone connects to the same measures or wants to know the same type of information. I love like significance tables, and you can give me like rows upon rows with asterisks, but for most people that's not enjoyable reading. And for those of you who've been in webinar 1, I used an infographic around buying cake to illustrate the difference between outcomes and outputs. And that's something that works really well for potential audiences that are new to theory of change and the whole framework. But if I'd done that at an academic conference, it probably would have lost me out of the room. So just be mindful to tailor your message to the audience. And while you probably aren't able to communicate and create something specific for every single stakeholder, it's really valuable to kind of segmentize it a bit and to effectively communicate with these segments. And again, like your theory of change workshop attendance can be a really good idea there. Like, who are the main key stakeholders that you consulted when you did your theory of change? Those are probably also the people that like are most interested and that have the most legitimate interest to understand what's going on. Thirdly, like what channels work best for what audience? And that kind of goes hand in hand with like the second point, but like right now you've got so many different channels that you can go through. There's social media, you can, I mean, not right now, but theoretically you could run events, use infographics, you can do like videos, you can do community engagement events, blog posts, fact sheets, long case studies, like generally like use creativity here, and you're the program experts on what you're doing. Just be mindful that it's not always a channel that you might prefer. So nothing makes me feel older than when I talk to our admissions team and they talk about how successful their TikTok strategy was. Like, would I have ever applied to a university that tries to advertise itself to me via TikTok? Probably not, but it works for that audience. So just think, and it works on that channel for that audience. So like think that through when you think about reporting externally. And then also create your communication product. So whether that's a report or a blog post, etc., accordingly. So frame your evidence according to what resonates with your stakeholders. In general, like what I've learned a lot working across the sector is that schools listen to other schools, like academics listen to other academics. So just be mindful there around like what works for an academic audience. Is that probably more of a like really like academically written paper, and for the practitioner there's probably something around individual stories and telling it that way. But that's just a generalization of always true. And then lastly, engage your network. So champions in your network can be integral to getting your evaluation story and learnings out to a wider audience. So first of all, identify these champion stakeholders. So if you've got to really engage schools and you're looking to recruit more schools for your follow-up evaluation, as I said, they tend to listen to each other. So if you get one school leader or a head teacher on board, like, and they can basically promote it for you, and they've got like a report that really aligns to what they want to know, then that can be really useful. general. And in general, these kind of peer ambassadors or messengers are really credible advocates for evidence use. And practitioners, but also mediators and academics. So again, these three actors are really, really useful partners in mobilizing knowledge and integrating evidence into context across the knowledge mobilization framework. So that ends the reflect part of it. My parting words this time for everyone is that OQs don't open new doors. So that used to be something that the old director for social mobility and student success at King's, Anne-Marie Canning, used to say. And the idea there is that knowledge mobilization is a really new field, and we haven't cracked it yet. And you, as like really important actors in that field, are part and parcel to how we crack it and how we hopefully be able to start having that acting, sharing, understanding, finding, information exchange going forward. And that's it. Now we've got time for questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Miriam. We've got about 5 questions right now. 3 of them relate to, although I think you may need to answer them separately, Miriam. They do relate, though, to the question of in higher education, linking constructs and indicators. In higher education, so this is Alvin's question specifically, Alvin Lung, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. In higher education settings, are there some important constructs that are particularly difficult for setting indicators, in your opinion? And Sam Bailey has asked, I think, a similar-ish question, which is, are there resources bringing together outcome indicators for some less tangible constructs, so constructs such as well-being or belonging, where, you know, it might be harder to imagine what that indicator is, and those may pose particular issues around reliability and validity. So yeah, maybe those 2 you could take together.
Yeah, so I think Sam kind of answered the question for the first one. So for example, sense of belonging or well-being is something that's really difficult, right? Because there's a lot of unobservables there that influence both of those, like family education in AG has a massive effect, as we know, on whether someone feels like they belong to AG. But we can't really measure that for most of our bits. But also, like, well-being depends on so many factors, and it can change depending on the context. Like, I could tell you today I feel great, and tomorrow, I don't know, I might not have breakfast, and you ask me at the same time, and I don't feel that great. So that's, like, for example, and something there. It's a lot around like performance related things as well, where it's not just about how someone does on a test, but also what feeds into whether they're doing well or not at that moment. But again, like the common outcome measures framework has a lot of those obscure constructs in there and tries to answer some of them, which is then a good segue to what Sam asked in regards to well-being. So obviously, well-being is a fluid concept, but it's something that has been quite well researched, not just in higher education, but across a lot of research fields. And there are verified scales that are both tested for construct validity and reliability. So there is one that we mentioned in our common outcome measures framework, which is a Warwick-Annenberg scale for mental health and well-being that can also be age adjusted. So there's obviously something there that academically validated scales sometimes are quite difficult to understand unless you are a highly educated adult. So it's a verified scale that can be used at different age scales and that offers really valid results. And also it's quite condensed. So I think it's only 9 questions in the condensed form, but it gives quite good insights into the mental well-being of the respondent. And sense of belonging, yes. So again, there is a lot of academic research out there that looks at social factors that influence sense of belonging. So the Common Outcome Measures framework, again, has something of that in there. So we use research by Pasquarelli et al., which looks at sense of belonging for first-year students. And he's been doing that research since the 80s. So there were a lot of like testing and validation of that. So if you refer to the Common Outcome Measures framework, it should be in there. And it is, like, I know that King's, for example, has these kind of questions integrated in their enrollment and re-enrollment process now. So everybody gets asked to quickly ask 5 questions around their well-being and sense of belonging at King's when they enroll and re-enroll. So that's quite a valid indicator.
Okay, I'm just gonna, 2 more I'm gonna sort of take together. I suppose this takes a similar question but broadens it further, which is how do we determine more generally the most this is from Sarah writing, the most valid and reliable measures or style survey questions. So this is kind of for evaluation. And I think it even, you started to answer actually in the previous question by pointing out that there are existing ways of asking or trying to get at certain kinds of constructs. I guess that also relates to the final question, sorry, which is there is a question to maybe explain again or slightly in a different way the definition of a construct, because in the measurement diagram that you provided. So I think maybe just as you answer the question from Sarah on how to determine the most valid and reliable measures of survey questions, you could perhaps just explain again the difference between a construct and a measure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not surprised that that some people struggle with like what is a construct, because it is so abstract, and often needing something else, i.e. an indicator, to make it more concrete. So construct is the idea of something that you want to measure, right? So let's say we want to measure sense of belonging. Unfortunately, in my student database, there isn't like a form like ethnicity, age, gender that just tells me, oh, sense of belonging, or 5 out of 5. So we need to find something to measure sense of belonging. So sense of belonging becomes is the construct. But like based on this idea, how can we now find data that tells us whether Miriam feels like she belongs to Kings more than Eliza does, for example? And there we need to think about what data is available and what research method can I use. So am I just going to go up to Eliza and Miriam and ask them? Has advantages and disadvantages, right? We talked about them earlier. But then also what I ask might bias what they are responding, because what I think sense of belonging is isn't necessarily what they think sense of belonging is. So academically verified skills, like the one that I mentioned from Pasquarelli, so the construct of sense of belonging, will basically test certain ways of wording and run it to so many samples that it, first of all, remember when we had the bullseye here, that it will lend as close as possible to like the bottom right. So we not only know that everybody answers similarly, so that's like high validity for the construct, but also that it repeats. So like we have the same results with different cohorts. And in order to test that, there are certain statistical methods that can provide that. So if you Google it, there's something like Cronbach's Alpha that can talk a bit about that. But in general, you don't need that. Just if you go on Google Scholar and you like search for sense of belonging, and then maybe student or high or university, you might find research papers that have already used scales or interview questions, and they have topic guides attached in the appendix that you can use.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and it's from Anuradha Roy. And she's asked, with regards to parental engagement, at what stage of the process should we take into account the parent's form of employment? I suppose that's, yeah, as a variable to when would you collect it, I suppose, and yeah, at what stage of the process would you take that into account?
What depends on your research question, to be
Yes.
like if your research is really interested in like how much does parental education or employment have an impact on parental engagement, then you should have that as one of the key variables in there. And you can collect that because most of the time when you work with parents and children, you need a consent form anyway to make sure that you can use their data. So you could like ask from the very beginning that parents consent to report the employment, and it obviously won't be identified back to them when you report, but you can make it just part of like collecting as business as usual.
Yeah, I think also the question is implying here, i.e. single household and working late shifts, perhaps, and this gets to your point about the data some people may have dropped out. So maybe some parents are we're less likely to have that information. It might be missing data. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Miriam.
One last point on that, actually, now that I think about it. So, I mean, obviously that's a luxury of working in the university and it doesn't apply to everyone, but like sometimes also think about administrative data that might already be out there. Yes. That has either that indicator or a proxy to it. So I know that HESA has something, the Higher Education Statistical Agency. So the individual learner record is something that every university has to produce, and they have something around family background in there. So it has yes. Whether a parent has attended higher education or higher education experience or something like that. So sometimes you could probably just like kind of connect data sources like that if you've got access to those, and that's worth considering too.
I think I'm going to have to stop you there, Miriam. I think we've answered most of the questions. Please do follow up by email. I noticed time, and I'm going to be just giving 30 seconds or a minute more, and then you can go. Um, so wrapping up, I just urge you to look at TASO's website. That there were some questions around resources. We do have resources. We will be continuing to refine and improve that. We've just started up recently, but that part of the website will be expanded. As we've said, these 3 webinars have been recorded. The first 2 are up and available already. The toolkit that's on our website, we're really proud of. We worked quite hard on that, including Miriam, of course. And I'd encourage you to explore that evidence toolkit because it summarizes existing evidence approaches to widening participation and student success. And finally, 2 finalies, remember that you will be getting an email from us requesting your feedback for a post-event survey to tell us what you thought. And it'd be great so that we can make sure that we're pitching this the right way, that these webinars are working for you, because obviously we're trying to learn to make sure that our work is as effective as it can be. And finally, we are expanding our team at TASO. So we're currently looking for 2 programs officers who are going to have to be having some expertise in quantitative research methods, and then a more senior research programs manager. We're also looking for some new trustees. So please look at our website and consider applying or sending those opportunities on to people in your networks. That's all from me. I don't know if there's anything I've forgotten, Miriam, but otherwise, thank you again for joining.
Yeah, come work with us and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.